International Christian Embassy Jerusalem is your embassy in the heart of Israel, founded in 1980. From our headquarters in Jerusalem through our branches in over 80 nations and yours in Canada, we seek to challenge the church to take up its scriptural responsibility, to remind Israel of the promises made to her in the Bible, and to be a source of practical assistance to all the people in the land of Israel. On today's program, author and pastor Giulio Gabeli talks about cultural diversities and the feasts. And our panel discusses the question, why do the members of the youth panel support Israel?
Pastor Gabeli, it's wonderful to have this opportunity to interview you.
Thank you, Christine. It's great to be here with you.
Yeshua has been depicted in the movie industry. Pictures on walls, a general personality that is very anglicized. For instance, anybody who's been to Israel knows that Jews are generally a passionate people. They're people that inquire, seek information, and they're verbal, they're communicators. Whereas the way Yeshua comes across in these traditional movies is, yes, he's humble, but he's very nonverbal. He's very quiet. We cannot possibly imagine how this individual can go through a temple with a whip of cords. And
yes, of course.
The culture of who Christ is, the persona of how Christ is presented in the gospel versus how he's presented in these movies is very different. And I wonder from a personal point of view how you contend with that entire image, which often translates into how we're taught to be. Don't ask questions, don't inquire, which is very different from how Shabbat is.
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, Jesus was not a European with blonde hair, as often is depicted in artwork. Jesus had black hair, he had a beard a little bit longer than mine. He was more olive skinned, just like I am, because that was the Middle East of the day. And so this Jesus being anglicized, you use the word anglicized, or being presented as a European, is actually, I believe, unfortunately, has been a consequence of, has really been a consequence of anti-Semitism.
And the movie industry. I have to stop and tell you the story. I was debating whether I should tell it, but a lady actually told me, a Canadian, she whispered, I expected the Jews to be like me, light skin with blonde hair. All I could do was laugh. But to me, this was the movie industry.
Right, that's right.
That gave her that image of how Jews are and how Christ looked.
No, exactly. Well, obviously, I think when you consider just the presentation of who Jesus was, Jesus was very, very dark in color. Jesus was also very straightforward. He was not so prim and proper as people think he was.
Passionate fellow.
He was not, he was not British, making sure that everything was said so properly and so prim and proper. In fact, if you go to Israel today, and there's a phrase that's used to describe Jews that are born in Israel, and they're called sabras. That phrase, sabra, actually means prickly pear. And if you ever seen the prickly pears, I mean, you try to handle a prickly pear, it's you're going to get kind of pricked. And it's going to be very, very, very harmful and a little bit damaging. But within the prickly pear, there's a very delicious fruit.
Very well described.
Exactly. So what very often you will see Jewish people. Jewish people are they can be very, hard and very brash sometimes. They can confront you. They're always asking questions. They're going to challenge what you say. And that just seems to be within the DNA that correctness or politically correct language very often is not present. We're people of the heart. And so we're going to speak very clearly. There's no personal space. We're going to challenge what you say, but we're prickly on the outside, but we have tender hearts.
But right there, you're giving a pastoral message of the Lord looking on the heart, because Scripture talks about being humble, having a contrite heart. But for some reason, culturally, that prickly exterior that you describe, it could be misinterpreted.
Yes.
culturally speaking.
Right. And in fact, very often, that's exactly what happens, where, folks will be kind of turned off because they don't recognize that Israelis just in general, or Jews in general, because of our personal history and DNA, we've had to be very, very tough on the outside. In other words, the expression, tough skin, but a soft heart. And really that is because of personal history and DNA, where when you're always becoming the target of trouble and the target of criticism and the target of anti-Semitism and you're always on the edge very often, that just seems to be common, like a common behavior as you react and respond to people. But that unfortunately can cause some people to turn away from Jews or misunderstand them, or not just embrace and accept them for who they are, because they want everything to be so prim and proper. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense from that perspective, but also on the other side, there's a cultural component that I think you've already addressed in terms of just the persona. I mean, you look at various cultures, even the Italian culture.
Yeah.
It's very alive.
That's right.
Very
Very
verbal.
passionate.
And many are.
Yes.
And it could be misinterpreted.
Yes.
The Arab culture, same thing.
Yes.
And they're Arab Christians. The Copts, they're very verbal, very outspoken, seemingly
Right.
prickly, but at the same time, they may have a contrite heart. And this is an area that I think that the Messianic Jews have a lot to teach. The Anglicized church, the differences in culture,
Yes.
and what is really scriptural and what might not be, according to appearance and the mix-up of how culture presents itself.
Yes, I totally agree with you. There is a passion within the Jewish culture, but specifically it's the Middle East, because Middle Eastern culture is a culture of the heart, but very expressive, very, very, if you think about it, let me just go back for a moment. I know that Jewish people obviously are we've been told you need to study, you need to read, you need to continually ask questions. And in fact, I think I've mentioned this before, but the value of a student is not determined by his answers to questions, but is determined by the questions that we ask.
Yes.
So that we've been taught that. We've been forced to
That's a
think that
great
way.
teaching.
Forced to think that way, that we are to be asking questions, and we are to be very kind of confrontational in general. There's another opinion as well that you've possibly have heard, or a phrase that has been used about Jews, that with every two Jews there are three opinions. And the reason for that is because there's just constant debating, constant, confrontation. But that has been almost ingrained within our psyche, because we've had to fend for ourselves. We just can't be so prim and proper and can't be just so cerebral, but we are very passionate, very expressive in nature. But that's also within the Middle Eastern culture.
Yes, it is.
As a
Yes,
whole.
it is.
But yet, our North American, very anglicized mindset is, that's not the way we dialogue or we interact with people. But it is very passionate, whereas sometimes that anglicized perspective is very stoic. I guess that makes sense
Yes.
to you, doesn't it?
Now, our viewers are going to have the privilege to see you on many episodes, because you're going to be providing us with various teachings that are seen in your book, Grafted In, as well. But I'm going to have one final question for you, and because here you are, you're Italian, you're a Jew, and you're also a Christian. What is your biggest challenge as a pastor, the go-between pastor? What is your biggest challenge?
My goodness. That's a very good question, Christine. I think there are a number of challenges, but
same here.
But I would say the first challenge, I think, is to be able to blend together who I really am, and not feel myself pressured to be one over the other. Because very often people like to label you, and sometimes being labeled, what comes with being labeled is certain expectations. And those expectations at times can actually cause a person to be something that they shouldn't be. And yet in my context, in my case, I realize that I do have a responsibility to be a bridge, going back to that word. I have the responsibility of teaching the Word of God as a pastor, with expectations that are placed upon me as a pastor. Obviously, from our Italian Jewish culture, there are also expectations of family, expectations of performing a certain way. And I'm not suggesting that that's correct, because we do talk about, wanting to be ourselves and wanting to not be so influenced by what other people think of us. But there are cultural expectations. There are mindsets that we deal with that very often can influence us. But as a pastor, I think it is important for me to embrace the biblical culture and to teach the biblical culture, and not find myself so often just communicating a Jewish Italian culture or the way we think. But we need to be focused on what the Bible says, which is very, very important. And one of the things that I think is very significant for me to mention as well, and I may talk a little bit about this later on, is the understanding of rabbinical Judaism as well as biblical Judaism. There's a difference between that. There's also a difference between Christianity and Christendom on the flip side of the coin. And again, these are some of the challenges that we do face even within a religious context, and the interface of religion and culture, and how we balance that all out is sometimes a challenge.
How important is it for Christians to recognize the Old Testament in terms of not just recognition, but even perhaps observing Jewish holy days?
Yes. Well, that's a very good question, Christine. I would like to begin by saying, first of all, that the Old Testament has not in any way been made less significant or nullified because of the New Testament. In fact, the Old Testament were the very scriptures that Jesus, the disciples, the early church fathers, the early church were Jews, and so they were always quoting from the Old Testament. I think it's very important for Gentile believers to acknowledge that in the Old Testament, God made very clear how the Jewish people were to live. Now, if someone would like to talk to me about circumcision or talk to me about kosher laws or kashrut and so on, I think the Bible makes it very clear that there were certain things that were specifically for Jews. But when it comes to celebrating the feasts and the specific days that were set aside where God says, this is my designated time, Leviticus chapter 23, the feast days, the calendar that the Lord, the biblical calendar, God says, those are my days. He didn't say these were days for the Jewish people. So none of that has changed in any way. In fact, if Gentile believers or New Testament believers want to understand the fullness of God's plan and purpose, they cannot discard the Old Testament. So to say that the Old Testament is irrelevant to Gentile believers is biblically incorrect, and in fact actually cripples a believer from walking in the fullness of all that God desires and requires from them today.
And from there, I'm kind of hearing that we should be worshiping on the Sabbath, Saturday, not the Sunday. Another story.
Another story.
Pastor Gabeli, your book, Grafted In, it's an excellent book. It's an excellent read, full of information, full of inspiration. Where can our viewers get a copy of this book?
Well, the book Grafted In was published by Word Alive, and they can find our book right across Christian bookstores all throughout Canada. Chapters, Indigo, Amazon.com. They can go to all these different sources, and they will find my book there as well.
I'll tell you, you're an inspiration to me, and I'm sure to our viewers. And once again, look for Pastor Gabeli on other episodes. It's been a privilege. Thank you very much.
We are standing here at Yad Vashem, and if you look behind me, that's actually the little street, little path that you would walk to the Children's Memorial. The Children's Memorial is for 1.5 million Jewish children who perished in the Holocaust. Some of them are very well known to us, and I would suggest that from Holland, Anne Frank would be the one that most people would recall. And the place where I'm standing right now is very special. In the book of Anne Frank, she wrote about a special tree she saw from her window. It was a chestnut tree, which by now would be about 170 years old. And in 2010, we received some of the saplings of that tree, and we were able to plant it here at Yad Vashem. So we are standing actually here by the tree that was planted, of the tree that Anna mentions in her diary.
Psalm 15. Lord, who will abide in your tabernacle? Who will dwell in your holy hill? He who walks uprightly and does righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. He who does not slander with the tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor bears a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears to avoid evil and does not change. He who does not put his money out to usury, nor take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be moved.
Welcome to Inside Israel. I'm Christine Williams. Today we have with us a young adult panel. Joining us, Corey Hembry-Bobechko, Meredith Hallbrook, and Veron Rodriguez. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Now, the topic of our discussion is going to be about why does our panel, each one, support Israel? And I'm going to start with you on this one, Veron. What is it about Israel that makes you stand up and say, look, I'm a supporter of Israel. I support Israel's right to exist. What is it?
Well, first and foremost for me, I had the opportunity to go to Israel in 2014. And prior to that, I'm a professing Christian and associate pastor at New Life Church Community Ministry. So being a believer, I have a direct relationship with God. And prior to me going to Israel in 2014, the Lord began to speak to me about his heart for Israel and to prepare to go. So my primary reason for supporting Israel is because of my relationship with the Lord. It's his chosen people, his chosen nation, and anything that God supports, I support. I'm his man here on earth, and so that's reason number one. Because the Lord has chosen Israel as a people unto his own, I make sure that my prayers are lifted up with the nation, and anything I can do to support them, I'll definitely do. Secondly, I'm very patriotic in terms of my nation, and Canada also supports Israel. So being a citizen that supports anything my government is doing to a degree, I also support Israel because of my citizenship being a Canadian. And secondly, I love the people and I love the nation. I know that when the Lord returns, he's going to be looking for a people in Israel that know him. And I want to ensure that I'm a part of that transition and a part of the awakening of the nation itself.
Yes, okay. Meredith.
Well, my reason's a little bit more selfish, is that when I first went to Israel 10 years ago now, sorry, it was an experience for me that really, I guess, grounded me. And it really made me humble in a sense that I think that we really take our life for granted here in Canada, and the lifestyle that we have and our, you know, anything that's really given to us. We're really, really blessed here. And people there are blessed in such a different way that really makes you appreciate life so much more. And that's one of the biggest things that stood out to me there when I first went, was I think that I was a very kind of self-centered person in a way then. And then when I went, I realized that God had so much more in store, and that there was so much more to give to these other people. And that was really something that kind of, I think step by step, opened up my eyes into loving Israel and supporting Israel so much more, because it just became so important to me. And I realized all the great things that were coming out of Israel, and the work and the love and the community and the family and this type of, I guess, connection that people have. And I really, over the years, felt more and more and more connected with the land, and to eventually really call it home. And I do find that that's the second home for me. And I think that a lot of people that do go to Israel do find that there is that longing to go back, and there is something that they find there that they never had before. And that's really something that draws people back, and there is the support, because sometimes you can't explain it necessarily if it is biblical or if it is political or if there is, maybe you don't agree with a lot of the other things that are happening, but there is always a certain type of pull that you'll find to the land and to the people that you can't necessarily put into words. And so that's something for me that no matter what really happens, you know, there's a lot of issues and a lot of real issues that are surrounded with Israel and with that area. But I think the best thing that you can do is try to humanize situations. And if you're talking with people that maybe don't understand, then just to kind of put it into their shoes and make it a little bit more relative. But it's become a very important thing for me. And so this is something that I truly believe in. I love supporting Israel, even though it's not the easiest thing to do. But it's, you know, it's a journey. It's really a wonderful adventure.
Meredith, you say it's not an easy thing to do. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that a lot of people look at the government of Israel and they don't necessarily look at Israelis. And there's a lot of, it doesn't actually really matter if it's in the news or not. There's already an image ingrained in people's heads as to what Israel is. So it doesn't really matter necessarily if there's wonderful media of what's happening or you hear these great stories. It's still the words that come to mind are occupier, is apartheid, is, you know, all these really awful words that come to mind. And this is something that you don't even need to be in politics by any means, and a lot of people aren't, because they have their own lives. And these are the things that they'll hear, and this is just something that it takes a lot of time to change your opinion. And a lot of people don't have the time to do that on their own. That you can't just decide, okay, one day, I never really liked Israel, why should I change my opinion now? I'm gonna go out and find all this research as to why Israel is not a bad place. So I think that it really takes someone that's been there, and why it's so important for people to go is because I think it's the personal stories that really get people interested, because if it's coming from a friend, then they know that it's a credible source, someone that they respect or they rely on or they believe, and this kind of stuff. Because Israel is just not popular, and it's harder to disagree with someone. With everyone not being very fond of Israel, you know, you can easily agree and move on and move on to other conversations. But if you disagree, you're going to have to pull out proof as to why you disagree. And that takes work. So if you're able to, like for myself, I work a lot with non-for-profits and NGOs. And the stories that I brought back to my friends, I usually like to stay away from politics, but I like to show that there is two sides to everything. And with my friends, seeing that they've seen me go back over for 10 years now, they can see that, okay, if she's going back for 10 years and there's great stories coming over and she's having, you know, there's a reason to keep on going back, then there must be a reason why Israel's such a great place. Maybe there's something more to it. So I think that's, you know, it's very important. And so it's very important for people to go and for people to start up these kind of conversations.
Now, Corey, what about you? What is it that draws you to Israel?
Well, it began with my faith, and as I grew up as a Christian. I always went to Christian school, went to church. My parents raised me as a Christian, and as I began to get older and had to face, you know, is this faith my parents or is this faith mine? And having to really ask those tough questions as I grew, going back into the Old and New Testaments and looking at Israel and how it has a place in God's plan, and how the Jewish people have so much history in that land, and God is not done with them in that land. So for me, that was the first part of it. That was the first part of my journey. And then in my university years, being confronted with, you know, the BDS movement and Israel apartheid and all of that, then having to ask myself that question, okay, well, politically, what do I think? And how does my faith apply to politics? And I've come to the conclusion, first it was intellectual, that Israel is our best chance for peace in the Middle East. And then it became very personal when I was able to go to Israel and journey to Israel. And that definitely changed my opinion as well. just being there and like Meredith was saying, experiencing the atmosphere and the people and just the incredible integrity that they have to live there, how life and death is so much more real there than it is here because they're having to stand up. They have to put their money and their lives where their mouth is when it comes to their freedom and peace, whereas here we often take that for granted. So it definitely, that experience changed the way that I viewed everything.
Now, Israel is indeed the only light of democracy sitting brightly shining in the Middle East. It's very interesting hearing from these young adults what it is about Israel that attracts them, why it is that they're even willing to speak on a TV show such as this to discuss their own impressions and their own faith when it comes to Israel. I'm happy to report, though, that they're not finished because we're going to be running a part 2.
We conclude our program today with some sights and sounds within Israel. In consideration of Canada's 150th birthday, please consider 150 ways to bless Israel through your Christian embassy, the ICEJ Canada. Consider becoming a $150 monthly donor. Plant 150 trees, 150 prayers for Israel. The opportunities are endless. Please contact us. Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to visit our website at www.icejcanada.tv or call us at 1-866-324-9133. Through your contribution to ICEJ Canada, you can participate by giving to Haifa Home for Holocaust Survivors, Women at Risk, Red Carpet Project, Operation Life Shield, Bomb-Proof Shelters, Shoulder to Shoulder, Alias Support, Beth Singer Children's Home, Israel in Crisis, ICEJ Communication Media Fund, Christian Friends of Yad Vashem, Magen David Adom Emergency Services, Canada Israel Young Adult Scholarship, Equip and Teach, Bet Rachel Strauss Inclusive Community, Gift, Estate, and Securities Funds.